There are stories Hollywood likes to tell about itself. Stories of glamour, of easy charm, of men in tuxedos laughing over glasses of amber liquor while flashbulbs popped like fireworks. And then there are the stories Hollywood doesn't like to tell, the quiet ones, the ones that happen after the cameras stop rolling, in a hallway, in a dressing room, in the space between one joke and the next. This is one of those stories. It is not about fame. It is not about rivalry. It is about a moment, one single moment, when the loudest man in the room said something he shouldn't have, and the calmest man in the room taught him what strength actually looks like. It's a story about John Wayne, and it's a story about Dean Martin. But most of all, it's a story about a woman who was never trying to be part of it all. By the mid-1960s, there are few men in America bigger than John Wayne. He was 6'4" of unshakable certainty, a walking monument to a version of masculinity that audiences lined up around city blocks to see reflected back at them. He didn't act tough. He simply was. Or at least, that's what 30 years of Westerns had convinced the world. But behind the myth was a man who had built his entire identity on being the biggest presence in any room he walked into. And for the most part, nobody challenged him on it. Not directors. Not co-stars. Certainly not journalists, who treated an audience with Wayne the way one might treat an audience with a sitting king. Then there was Dean Martin. The two men were, on paper, unlikely friends. One had built a career punching outlaws off horses. The other had built a career making heartbreak sound like a lullaby. But Hollywood in that era was smaller than people imagine. A village dressed up as an empire, and men like Wayne and Martin crossed paths constantly. At premieres, at charity dinners, at the celebrity roast that had become, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, one of the strange, beloved rituals of American show business. The roasts were built on a peculiar kind of intimacy. Friends stood at a podium and tore each other apart, line by line, joke by joke, and an entire audience understood instinctively that the cruelty was the affection. The meaner the joke, the more it proved you belonged to someone's inner circle. Nobody roasted a stranger. You only roasted the people who mattered to you. Wayne and Martin had roasted each other before. Wayne once stood at a podium honoring Martin and delivered a string of jokes so dry the audience nearly missed the punchlines before they landed. Jokes about Martin's drinking, about his singing, about the two of them once nearly co-starring as unlikely screen romantics. The crowd howled. Martin, for his part, simply raised his glass, smiled a half-lidded smile of his, and let the joke land without flinching. That was the deal. That was the game everyone had agreed to play. But there's a difference most people forget in the moment, caught up in the laughter and the lights, between a joke that lands on a man and a joke that lands on the person he loves most in the world. And it was that difference, on one particular evening, that would test everything the world thought it knew about both men. To understand why that difference mattered so much, you have to go back further, back before the roast, before the fame had fully calcified into myth, to two very different young men trying to survive in an industry that chewed up anyone who couldn't figure out how to be useful to it. John Wayne had not always been John Wayne. He had been Marion Morrison once, a name the studios decided wasn't rugged enough, wasn't American enough, for the image they intended to build around him. He spent years in forgettable westerns before Stagecoach made him a star, and by the time the world knew his adopted name, he had already learned the industry's cruelest lesson, that an image once built has to be maintained at all costs, because the moment audiences stop believing in it, the myth collapses and takes the man down with it. That lesson shaped him more than most people realized. Wayne carried his persona like armor, on set and off, because he understood, perhaps better than any other star of his generation, that the public didn't merely want John Wayne. They needed him to be exactly the man they'd built in their imaginations. Steady, certain, untouchable, and a man who spends 30 years being untouchable can, without ever meaning to, start believing that nothing he says can actually wound anyone. Dean Martin's path had been almost the inverse. Born Dino Crocetti in a steel town in Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants, he had clawed his way up through boxing rings and small nightclubs long before Hollywood ever noticed him. He knew what it was to be laughed at for his accent, his background, his name, and rather than resent it, he had turned that vulnerability into an art form. He built a career on seeming like he didn't care what anyone thought of him, all while in private. caring enormously about the small number of people who had earned his trust. It's a peculiar thing, fame. It takes two men who start from such different places and puts them in the very same rooms, expects them to perform the very same rituals of friendship and rivalry, without ever asking whether the ground beneath each of them is actually the same. Wayne had built his life on being untouchable. Martin had built his on being unbothered. Neither quality, it would turn out, prepared either man fully for the moment when something touched a nerve that mattered. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Dean Martin's wife was to him. Not the tabloid version, not the studio-approved version, but the private one. She was not, by nature, a woman who sought the spotlight. She had learned, over years of being married to one of the most famous entertainers alive, how to exist gracefully in rooms built entirely around someone else's fame. She smiled at premieres. She stood 2 steps behind at photographs. She let interviewers ask her husband the questions and answered, when asked at all, in a handful of careful words. But to Dean Martin, she was the only quiet place in a very loud life. Those close to him would say that whatever version of Dean Martin the public saw, the crooner, the jokester, the effortlessly cool centerpiece of every party he attended, there was another version entirely that existed only at home. A man who worried about his children. A man who sat quietly some nights with a drink he barely touched, thinking about a career that had cost him more than the world ever saw. And in that private world, she was the still center around which everything else was allowed to spin out of control. He rarely spoke of her in public, not because he was ashamed, but because, as those who knew him best understood, there are things a man protects precisely by refusing to hand them over for entertainment. Dean Martin had spent 2 decades letting the world laugh at his drinking, his singing, his easy Italian charm turned into punchlines. He gave the world nearly everything to laugh at. Everything except her. Those who spent time in a Martin household would later describe a marriage that looked, from the outside, almost unremarkable compared to chaos that so often surrounded Hollywood's biggest names. There were no headline-grabbing scandals attached to her, no carefully staged photo opportunities designed to manufacture a romance for the cameras. She simply existed steadily at the center of his private life, the way a lighthouse exists at the edge of a coastline. Not the subject of the voyage, but the thing that made the voyage survivable. Dean Martin's friends would later say that whatever mask he wore in public, the loose tie, the perpetual glass of what audiences assumed was whiskey, but was, more often than not, colored water for the sake of the bit, came off entirely the moment he walked through his own front door. At home, he was simply a husband, a father, a man occasionally short on words, but never short on presence. It's worth remembering, too, that fame in that era extracted a particular toll on the spouses of its biggest stars, a toll rarely acknowledged in the glossy magazine spreads of time. Wives were expected to be decorative and silent, supportive and invisible, present at premieres but absent from headlines. It took a particular kind of quiet strength to live inside that arrangement without losing yourself entirely to it. And by most accounts, she managed it with a grace that even Dean, notoriously difficult to impress, deeply admired, which is precisely why the joke that would be told about her on that particular night cut so much deeper than an ordinary joke might have. It wasn't merely an insult aimed at a public figure accustomed to public scrutiny. It was an insult aimed at someone who had spent years deliberately, carefully, staying out of the spotlight her husband lived inside. Someone who had never asked, not once, to become part of anyone's punchline. The evening in question was, on its surface, unremarkable, a private industry dinner, the kind Hollywood held constantly in that era. Part celebration, part business, part theater for men who had spent their whole lives performing even when no cameras were rolling. Wayne was there, large in the room itself, trading stories with directors and drinking bourbon like it was owed to him. Martin arrived later, as he often did, slipping in with that unhurried grace that made an entrance feel like an afterthought rather than an announcement. The two men had always traded barbs easily. It was by that point an old and comfortable ritual, Wayne's booming insults, Martin's smooth deflections, the crowd around them laughing at both, delighted simply to be near two men who so clearly enjoyed needling one another. But somewhere in the third hour of the evening, after the bourbon had done what bourbon does to men who mistake volume for wit, Wayne reached for a joke that crossed a line he had never crossed before. It wasn't a joke about Martin's drinking, or his singing, or his slow, half-closed-eyed stage persona. It was a joke about his wife. A cruel little line, tossed off with the careless confidence of a man who had never once in his life worried about consequences, delivered loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The exact words don't matter, and in truth, the details are blurred with decades of retelling, as these stories always do. What matters is what the joke was. An attempt, whether Wayne fully realized in the moment or not, to turn something private and precious into a punchline for public amusement. A joke meant to get a laugh at the expense of the one person Dean Martin had never allowed to become part of the show. For a moment, nobody moved. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly what kind of room this was, because the setting matters as much as the words themselves. This was not a public stage, not a televised roast where every line had been vetted, rehearsed, and approved by lawyers and network censors weeks in advance. This was the informal version of that same ritual. The private dinners where Hollywood's biggest names gathered without cameras, believing, perhaps naively, that whatever was said in that room would stay contained within it. That belief, that privacy would somehow soften the consequences of cruelty, is one of the oldest and most persistent illusions of fame. The truth is that words don't become less sharp simply because fewer people are around to hear them. If anything, the absence of cameras can make men bolder, more careless, more willing to say things they'd never risk saying in front of a live audience of millions. Wayne, deep in the fourth bourbon of an evening that had started at 6 and showed no signs of ending before midnight, had let exactly that kind of carelessness get the better of him. Later, some who were present would try to soften the memory, insisting the joke had been meant affectionately. In the spirit of the same needling banter, the two men always traded. Others would recall it differently, as a joke with genuine edge to it, delivered with just enough of a smirk to suggest Wayne knew, on some level, exactly how far he was pushing. The truth, as it so often is with stories retold across decades, likely sits somewhere between those two memories. What is not in dispute, among those who were there, is what happened in the seconds immediately after the joke landed. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when everyone realizes, all at once, that something has gone too far. It isn't dramatic. Nobody gasps. Glasses don't shatter on marble floors. It's quieter than that. A subtle stiffening of shoulders, a handful of eyes darting sideways, the sudden, collective awareness that laughter, if it comes now, will mean something different than it did 30 seconds ago. Wayne, to his credit, or perhaps simply from the same instinct that had made him a star, the instinct to read a room, seemed to sense almost immediately that the joke had landed wrong. He gave a short laugh, the kind meant to invite others to laugh along and dissolve the tension. A few nervous chuckles rippled out from nearby tables. It was the sound of people trying to convince themselves nothing had really happened. All eyes turned, whether they meant to or not, toward Dean Martin. This was a moment, as those who witnessed it would later describe, when the entire evening seemed to balance on a single breath. Dean Martin was not a small man, and he was certainly no stranger to conflict. Anyone who had spent years alongside the volatile, unpredictable energy of men like Frank Sinatra knew how to read danger in a room and how to answer it. He could have stood. He could have raised his voice. He could have matched Wayne's joke with something sharper, something designed to humiliate in return, and no one in that room would have blamed him for it. Those who knew him well understood that Dean Martin's temper, when it surfaced at all, rarely surfaced loudly. He was not a man who threw glasses or overturned tables. His anger, on the rare occasions anyone glimpsed it, tended to arrive as a kind of stillness, a drop in temperature rather than a rise in volume. Those who had crossed him before, even in small ways, often said the same thing afterward, that the moment to worry wasn't when Dean raised his voice, because he almost never did. The moment to worry was when he went quiet. And in that banquet hall, in front of dozens of the industry's most powerful men, he went very quiet indeed. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He did none of the things a room full of onlookers, primed by a lifetime of movies exactly like the ones Wayne starred in, might have expected from a wounded man defending his wife's honor. There was no dramatic score swelling underneath the moment, no slow motion pushed toward a confrontation. There was only a man setting down a glass and choosing, deliberately, consciously, a different kind of response entirely. what Dean Martin did instead, and what would become, in the retelling among those who were there that night, the detail people remembered most vividly was set down his glass, slowly, deliberately, the kind of gesture that says more than any raised voice ever could. He looked at Wayne, not with anger, not with the wounded flash of a man caught off guard, but with something far more disarming, a quiet, unhurried steadiness. The same steadiness that had let him walk into any room in Hollywood and own it without ever raising his voice. And then, in a tone so calm it seemed almost gentle, he spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded Wayne, in front of everyone, in a voice that never once wavered, that a man's wife was not a stage, and she had not signed up to be part of anyone's act. He said the way you might correct a child who didn't yet understand the way of his own words, not with cruelty, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly where the line is, because he spent his whole life making sure never to cross it himself. He reminded Wayne, gently, that he had built his own career, giving the world every part of himself to laugh at, his voice, his drinking, his image, precisely so that the people he loved would never have to. And he said, quietly, that whatever Wayne thought he was owed as the biggest man in any room, he was not owed that. There was no threat in his voice, no demand for satisfaction, just a plain, unornamented truth, delivered the way only a man completely secure in himself could deliver it, without needing to raise his voice to prove he meant it, and that, as it turned out, was more powerful than any shout could ever have been. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what it must have felt like to be sitting at one of those nearby tables, close enough to hear every word, too far to intervene even if you'd wanted to. Careers had been built, in that era, on knowing exactly when to laugh and when to stay silent, on reading a room the way a sailor reads a changing sky. And every person in that hall understood, almost instantly, that laughter now would be a betrayal, not a Wayne, and not even entirely a Martin, but the plain decency that had just been spoken aloud in a room built on the opposite of decency. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. A few eyes dropped to their plates, suddenly fascinated by food they had no intention of eating. Others simply watched, transfixed, waiting to see which version of John Wayne would answer, the myth or the man. There's an old idea, one that shows up again and again across every culture and every century, that real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need an audience of its own. It simply is steady, unshaken, entirely unconcerned with proving itself to anyone. John Wayne had spent 30 years playing men defined by exactly that kind of strength. Men who didn't need to raise a fist because their steady, unblinking presence did the work for them. It was perhaps one of the strange ironies of that evening, that the very quality Wayne had built an entire career pretending to embody was, in that moment, being demonstrated in front of him by someone else, in real life, without a script or a director calling action. Those who watched it happen would later say that something shifted visibly in Wayne's face. Not embarrassment exactly. Wayne was not a man built for public embarrassment, but something closer to recognition. The look of a man realizing, all at once, that he had reached for the easy laugh and found, on the other side of it, something considerably more serious than he'd expected. Because here's the truth about men who have spent their whole lives being the loudest, biggest presence in every room. They are rarely challenged, and so they rarely have to examine themselves. Nobody tells a king he's wrong. Nobody dares. Wayne had built a life and a myth around never having to hear it. Until that night, there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being untouchable, a loneliness that men like Wayne rarely spoke of, because admitting to it would have undone the very myth that made them so beloved in the first place. To be surrounded, always, by people who laugh at your jokes not because they're funny, but because you're John Wayne, is to lose, slowly and without realizing it, the ability to tell the difference between genuine respect and simple deference. What Dean Martin offered him, in that quiet reply, was something Wayne had likely not experienced in years, an honest reaction, unfiltered by the fear of upsetting a powerful man. Not flattery, not deference, just the truth, delivered plainly by someone who respected him enough not to let him get away with something beneath him. It is a strange kind of gift, being told the truth by someone who could easily have chosen silence instead. And whether Wayne recognized it in that moment, or only much later, lying awake replaying the evening in his mind, Something about that gift seemed to reach him in a way that a decade of professional flattery never had. What happened next is a part of the story that people who were there remember most clearly, because it was by every account entirely out of character for the man everyone thought they knew. John Wayne, a man not known by any stretch for backing down, for admitting fault publicly, for softening in front of an audience, set down his own glass. He didn't wait for the room to demand it of him. He didn't wait for someone else to smooth things over on his behalf, the way powerful men so often let others do for them. He looked at Dean Martin, and in a voice quieter than the one he'd used moments before, quieter notably than almost anyone in that room had ever heard him use, he apologized. He didn't dress it up. He didn't turn it into another joke to save face, the way men so often do when forced into a corner, using humor as an exit ramp from accountability. He said simply that he'd been wrong, that the joke shouldn't have been made, that Martin's wife deserved better than to be the punchline of another man's evening. And then, in the detail that those present would repeat for years afterward, the detail that turned an uncomfortable moment into a story worth telling, he said it loud enough for the same tables that had heard the joke to hear the apology too. He did not correct himself quietly, in some private aside meant only for Martin's ears. He corrected himself in front of everyone, exactly as publicly as the offense had occurred. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable things anyone in that room had ever witnessed. Not because an apology is rare. People apologize every day for far smaller things, but because of who was apologizing and to whom and why. Because the myth of John Wayne had never included the word sorry, and because Dean Martin had never needed to demand it. He had simply, calmly, made it impossible for Wayne to do anything else. Some who were present that night would later describe watching Wayne's shoulders drop slightly as he spoke the words, not in defeat, but in something closer to relief, as though some part of him had been waiting without knowing it, for permission to simply be human for a moment, rather than the towering, unbothered figure the world demanded of him at every turn. Martin, for his part, didn't linger on the moment. He didn't draw it out, didn't make Wayne sit in the discomfort any longer than necessary to make the point land. He gave a small nod, the kind that says we're finished here, picked his glass back up, and within a minute or two, the room's usual hum of conversation began to return, tentatively at first, then in full. By the time dessert arrived, most of the tables had moved on entirely, the way rooms full of powerful people so often do, eager to leave discomfort behind them as quickly as it arrived. But the people closest to both men, the ones who understood what they had just witnessed, knew that something had shifted permanently in those 90 seconds. Even the rest of the room had already moved on to lighter conversation. There's a lesson buried in that evening, one that has nothing to do with Hollywood or celebrity or the particular mythology of two very famous men. It's a lesson about what real strength looks like when nobody is watching for it, or rather, when everybody is watching, and strength is tested precisely because of that audience. We are taught, so often, that strength looks like Wayne on a movie screen, broad-shouldered, unshakable, quick with a comeback, ready to meet aggression with equal or greater force. We are taught to admire the man who never backs down, who answers every challenge with a bigger one. But that night, in a banquet hall, most of the guests will forget the exact date or within a few years. Something different happened. The lesson wasn't taught by the loudest man in the room. It was taught by the quietest one. Dean Martin didn't need to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He didn't need to threaten, to posture, to prove that he, too, could be cruel if pushed. He simply held his ground, calmly, plainly, without theater, and let the truth of what he'd said do the work that anger never could have done as effectively. And in doing so, he gave John Wayne, a man the world has spent 30 years building into a monument, a lesson no director, no critic, no co-star had ever managed to teach him. That real respect isn't something you take by being the loudest voice in the room. It's something you're given, freely, the moment someone realizes you never needed to raise your voice at all. Nobody knows exactly what passed through John Wayne's mind on the drive home that night, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But it is not hard to imagine, given everything we know about the man, that the ride was quieter than usual. Wayne had spent 3 decades being the man other men measured themselves against, the standard for toughness, for certainty, for a particular unshakable version of American manhood that a generation of boys had grown up trying to imitate. It is a strange kind of prison, being turned into a standard. You are no longer allowed to simply be a person who occasionally gets something wrong. You are expected at all times to already know better. And yet that night he had gotten something wrong. Publicly, undeniably. And instead of the world collapsing around in a way 3 decades of maintaining an image might have led him to fear, something else had happened instead. He had apologized. He had said the words. And the room, rather than turning on him, had simply exhaled and moved forward. It is entirely possible that this, more than the joke itself, more than the apology itself, was a true revelation of that evening for Wayne. The discovery that admitting fault did not, in fact, destroy him. That the myth could bend just slightly without shattering entirely. That there was more strength available to him in that single moment of honesty than in a decade of never once being wrong. Whether he ever articulated that realization to himself in so many words, we cannot know. Men of his generation, and certainly men of his particular public stature, were not in the habit of narrating their own emotional growth, even privately. But those who knew him in the years that followed would sometimes remark, almost in passing, that Wayne had grown a little quieter as he aged, a little less inclined to reach for the easy laugh at someone else's expense, a little more careful with the people around him. Perhaps that shift had many sources. But some who were in that banquet hall would always believe it started there, on one ordinary evening that nobody thought at the time would matter at all. What happened between the two men after that night is, in some ways, the most human part of the story, because it would have been easy, expected, even, for an evening like that to end a friendship, for Wayne to feel humiliated and quietly distance himself, for Martin to feel he could no longer trust a man who had, even briefly, been careless with something so precious to him. Neither of those things happened. By most accounts, the two men remained exactly what they had been before, friendly, easy in each other's company, still willing to trade the occasional barb at industry gatherings. But something had changed underneath the surface of that friendship, something subtle that those closest of both men noticed even if the wider public never did. Wayne, several people would later recall, never made another joke that came anywhere close to that line again. Not about Martin's wife, not about anyone else's. It was as if that single evening had recalibrated something in him permanently, taught him a boundary he hadn't previously known existed or hadn't previously respected enough to notice. And Martin, for his part, never brought the incident up again. He didn't hold it over Wayne. He didn't use it as leverage in future arguments, the way lesser men might have. He had said what needed to be said in the moment it needed saying, and once it was said, he let it go entirely, because that, too, is part of what real strength looks like. Not just standing your ground when it matters, but knowing when to release it once the point has been made. That, perhaps, is the quieter half of the story, the half people forget when they focus only on the drama of the joke and the shock of the apology. The real strength wasn't just in Martin's calm reply. It was in his willingness, afterward, to let the whole thing go, to move forward without resentment, without needing to remind Wayne of it at every future gathering. In the years that followed, the two men would go on to appear together at other industry functions, other roasts, other quiet dinners far from the cameras. Photographs survive from some of these later gatherings. Wayne and Martin seated side by side, drinks in hand, mid-laugh at some joke lost now to history. Anyone looking at those photographs today, without knowing what had passed between the two men years earlier, would see nothing but easy, uncomplicated friendship. And in truth, that's exactly what it had become. Not friendship built on the fear of crossing a line, not the strained politeness of men merely tolerating one another for the cameras, but something that actually deepened in its own quiet way because of what had happened rather than in spite of it. There is a particular kind of trust that can only be built after a mistake has been made, addressed, and genuinely repaired. Many friendships never survive that test at all. There's, by all accounts, not only survived it, it grew sturdier for having weathered it. This, too, is a detail worth sitting with. We live in a culture quick to write off relationships the moment someone reveals a flaw, a moment of carelessness, an unkind word spoken without enough thought behind it. We treat mistakes as verdicts rather than moments, as though the worst thing a person has ever said defines them more completely than everything they say and do afterward. But Dean Martin, in the way he handled that evening and everything that followed it, seemed to understand something more nuanced. That a mistake, honestly acknowledged and genuinely corrected, doesn't have to be the end of a relationship. Sometimes it can be the beginning of a more honest one. Perhaps the most striking detail in this entire story, one that speaks volumes about both men, is that Dean Martin's wife, by most accounts, never learned the full details of what had been said about her that night, or how close the evening had come becoming an entirely different kind of story. Martin never told her, not because he was hiding something shameful, but because, in his mind, there was nothing for her to carry. He had handled it. The moment had passed. Whatever ugliness had briefly entered that room had been met, answered, and resolved before it ever had the chance to touch her directly. That, too, is a kind of protection rarely spoken about, the quiet decision to shoulder a moment of conflict entirely alone, rather than pass even a fraction of his weight onto the person you're protecting. Dean Martin didn't need her to know how fiercely he'd stood up for her. He only needed to know himself that he had. There is something deeply moving in that, in a man choosing to be strong not for recognition, not for a story that will be told and retold for decades, but simply because it was the right thing to do, in a moment when almost anyone else might have laughed along instead. It is worth imagining, too, what her life looked like in the years that followed. Unaware, going about her days, raising children, hosting dinners, living an entire private existence that had nothing to do with the momentary storm that had passed through a banquet hall on a night she wasn't even present for. She never had to carry the discomfort of knowing what had almost been said about her in public, never had to wonder, at future gatherings, whether the men around her were secretly laughing at some joke made at her expense. That, in its own quiet way, is perhaps the truest measure of what Dean Martin did that night. Not the words themselves, and not even the apology they produced, but the fact that it absorbed an entire moment of conflict on her behalf so thoroughly that it never had to touch her at all. He didn't just offend her honor in the room where the insult occurred. He protected her from ever having to know the insult existed in the first place. There's a kind of love that announces itself loudly, grand gestures, public declarations, the kind of romance Hollywood built entire genres around depicting. And then there's a kind of love that works quietly, in the background, absorbing small storms before they ever reach the people it's protecting. Dean Martin, so often characterized publicly as easygoing to the point of indifference, showed that night that his quietness had never been indifference at all. It had simply been discretion, a willingness to do the hard, unglamorous work of protecting someone without ever needing credit for it. Hollywood has never been short on stories about its most famous men, stories designed to reinforce the myth studios spent millions building around them. John Wayne, the unshakable American icon. Dean Martin, the effortlessly cool crooner who never seemed to take anything, including himself, too seriously. But every so often, a story slips through that reveals something the myths never captured. A moment where the men behind the legends showed audiences something more valuable than another performance. A moment of real accountability. A moment of real grace. This is one of those stories. Not because it proves John Wayne was a villain. He wasn't. He was, by every account, a complicated man who occasionally let his own outsized confidence run ahead of his better judgment, as most powerful people eventually do. And not because it proves Dean Martin was some flawless saint. He wasn't that either, and he would likely have laughed at the suggestion. It's a story worth telling because it shows us something we don't often get to see in the retelling of old Hollywood legends. A mistake honestly made, a boundary calmly held, and an apology freely given, without needing to be dragged out of the person who owed it. In an industry built so heavily on image, on carefully managed reputations, on decades of publicists smoothing over every rough edge before the public ever saw it, this small, human moment stands out precisely because it wasn't manufactured for anyone's benefit. It happened between two men in a room, over the course of perhaps 90 seconds, and it asked nothing of the people watching except to witness it. Consider, for a moment, how differently the story might have unfolded had either man been someone slightly less secure in themselves. Had Wayne been the kind of man who doubled down when challenged, treating an apology as surrender he could never afford to make in front of an audience, the friendship, and quite possibly Wayne's own private sense of himself, might never have recovered. Had Martin been the kind of man who needed to win publicly, needed the room's applause to feel the point had landed, he might have pushed further than the moment required, turning an act of quiet dignity into a public spectacle that served his own ego rather than the truth he was defending. Instead, both men did the harder thing. Wayne resisted the urge to protect his pride at the expense of his integrity. Martin resisted the urge to humiliate a man who had humiliated, however briefly, someone he loved. Neither instinct is the one popular culture typically celebrates. We are far more accustomed to stories of righteous anger, of scores settled loudly and publicly, of villains punished and heroes vindicated in front of cheering crowds. This story offers none of that catharsis. It offers something quieter, and in its own way, considerably harder to achieve. Two flawed men choosing restraint, choosing honesty, choosing each other's dignity over their own immediate satisfaction. It would be easy to end the story here, with the apology given, the tension dissolved, the friendship quietly restored. But stories like this endure decade after decade because they hold up a mirror to something larger than the two men at their center. How many of us have been in that room? Not literally, not among movie stars and bourbon and candlelight, but in some smaller version of it. How many of us have watched someone we respect say something careless, something cruel, about a person who never asked to be part of the joke? And how many of us have found, in that moment, the calm clarity to respond the way Dean Martin did? Not with fury, not with humiliation returning kind, but with a steady, unshakable truth that leaves no room for anything except an honest reckoning. It is, perhaps, the hardest kind of strength to practice. Anger is easy. Anger asks nothing of us except to feel it and let it out. But calm, deliberate honesty, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, requires something far more difficult. The security of knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you will and will not allow, without needing anyone else's permission to hold that line. And it is, perhaps, an even harder thing to do what John Wayne did in that moment. To hear the truth, feel the sting of it, and instead of defending, instead of deflecting, instead of turning the moment into another joke to save face, simply say, "You're right, and I'm sorry." Because that, too, is a kind of strength the myths rarely show us. Not the strength of never being wrong, the strength of admitting it plainly the moment you realize you are. Think, too, about how rarely we extend that same grace to ourselves. So many of us carry old moments of carelessness, a joke that landed wrong, a comment we regretted the instant it left our mouths, a silence we let stretch too long when an apology was owed, and instead of addressing them plainly, the way Wayne eventually did, we bury them. We convince ourselves that acknowledging fault is the same as losing, that saying, "I was wrong," somehow diminishes us in the eyes of the people watching. But this story, however dramatized in the retelling over the years, points towards something worth holding on to, that admitting fault costs us far less than we imagine and protects far more than we realize. Wayne did not become less of a legend for apologizing that night. If anything, the men and women who witnessed it walked away with a slightly more complete picture of who he actually was. Not merely the myth built for movie screens, but a man capable, when it mattered, of setting the myth aside. And Dean Martin did not need to raise his voice, humiliate a friend, or turn a private wrong into a public war in order to protect the person he loved most. He simply told the truth calmly and trusted that the truth, spoken plainly by someone secure enough not to need to shout it, would do exactly the work it needed to do. Perhaps that is a real lesson worth carrying forward from an evening most of the people present would later struggle even to date precisely, not the specifics of who said what, or which bourbon Wayne had been drinking, or exactly how many tables overheard the exchange. The lesson is simpler than all of that, and considerably more durable. That real strength rarely needs to announce itself, and real accountability rarely needs to be dragged out of the person who owes it. Sometimes, all it takes is one person calm enough to tell the truth, and one person brave enough to hear it. Decades have passed since that evening. Both men have long since left the world they once towered over. Wayne in 1979, Martin in 1995, each mourned by an industry that has never quite stopped telling stories about them. Neither man is here to confirm every detail of the story that has, like so many tales from that golden, smoky era of Hollywood, been softened and shaped by decades of retelling. And that is worth remembering, honestly and openly. We cannot know, with certainty, every word that passed between them on any given night, real or imagined by those who love recounting old Hollywood legend. But what we do know, what history does confirm, is who these two men were at their best. We know Dean Martin as a man who protected the people he loved fiercely, quietly, without ever needing an audience to witness his devotion. We know John Wayne as a man capable, when it mattered, of setting aside the myth built around him and simply being human, flawed, occasionally careless, but not beyond the reach of accountability when it counted. Perhaps that's the real gift stories like this one offer us. Not a perfect historical record, but a reminder of what we hope is true about the people we admire. That even the biggest, loudest, most unshakable men we've ever watched on screen are capable, in a quiet moment away from the cameras, of listening, of learning, of saying the two words that cost nothing and mean everything. I'm sorry. And somewhere, in a version of that room that exists now only in memory and imagination, a woman who never knew how fiercely she'd been defended went on quietly living her life, loved, protected, and entirely unaware of just how much one calm sentence, spoken by the man beside her, had meant. It is tempting, when telling stories about the giants of old Hollywood, to flatten them into symbols, to let Wayne stand forever for a certain rugged American certainty, and let Martin stand forever for effortless, untouchable cool. It's a simpler kind of story, and in some ways a more comfortable one. Symbols don't apologize. Symbols don't need to. But the men themselves, whatever the truth of any single evening decades ago, were never actually symbols. They were people, imperfect, occasionally careless, capable of real tenderness and real thoughtlessness within the very same year, sometimes within the very same conversation. That perhaps is why a story like this one endures in a retelling, dramatized and reshaped as it inevitably becomes across decades of Hollywood folklore. Not because it proves anything definitive about who John Wayne or Dean Martin truly were behind closed doors, but because it captures something we recognize instinctively as true about people in general. That even the most towering figures among us are capable of both the careless joke and the genuine apology, sometimes within the same 90 seconds. And that the difference between the two, more often than we like to admit, comes down to whether someone nearby is calm enough and brave enough to hold the line. So the next time you find yourself in a room where someone has said something they shouldn't have, about a partner, a spouse, someone who never asked to be part of the joke, remember the quieter half of this story. Remember that you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need cruelty to answer cruelty. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is set down your glass, look the other person in the eye, and simply tell them the truth. The rest, more often than we expect, tends to take care of itself.